It was an ordinary Tuesday morning at Westbrook High School, and the classrooms buzzed with the usual sounds of students chatting and preparing for their lessons. In room 208, a group of teachers had gathered to discuss the curriculum and upcoming exams. The classroom, usually filled with the energy of students, now felt empty and cold, save for the quiet hum of conversation from the teachers. Among the group of educators was Miss Harris, a middle-aged teacher known for her stern demeanor and sharp tongue. Her hair was tied back in a tight bun, and she wore glasses that perched on the edge of her nose, giving her a look of constant disapproval. Her tone was always firm, and her authority in the classroom was unquestioned. She had earned a reputation for being a strict teacher who expected nothing less than perfection from her students. Seated near the front of the room was Jamal, a quiet 13-year-old boy with short curly hair and deep brown eyes. He had always been the kind of student who kept to himself, preferring to sit in the back and avoid the attention of others. His classmates often overlooked him, and he had grown accustomed to it. But the teachers, they saw him as an easy target for their jokes. That day, Jamal was sitting quietly at his desk, his fingers idly tracing the edges of his violin case, lost in his thoughts. He loved playing the violin, but no one at school really knew how much it meant to him. The teachers had no idea about his talent, and they wouldn't have cared if they did. Ms. Harris, noticing Jamal's presence in the back of the room, decided to take advantage of the moment. She had always seen Jamal as a boy who didn't quite fit in with the rest of the class. His reserved nature, his quiet demeanor, and the way he sat in the corner without making a sound. It all made him an easy target for her sharp humor. "Jamal," she called out, her voice loud enough to catch the attention of the other teachers. "How about you show us all your musical talent today? Play us a little something on that violin of yours," she said, her words dripping with sarcasm. The room fell silent as the other teachers turned to look at Jamal. They waited for him to respond, their eyes filled with amusement. They didn't expect him to say anything, much less play the violin. It was clear from their expressions that they thought he didn't belong in a room with such accomplished professionals. Jamal's heart raced. He had never been the type to draw attention to himself, especially not in front of a room full of adults. His fingers tightened around the violin case, but he didn't move. He knew that Ms. Harris didn't really mean it, that it was just another way for her to make fun of him. But the mocking smiles from the teachers were enough to make him feel small. Jamal had spent most of his life avoiding situations like this, where people expected him to perform or entertain them. But there was something inside him that pushed him to stand up and prove them wrong. As he slowly rose from his seat, his palms began to sweat. He could feel the eyes of the teachers burning into him, their laughter barely contained. The mocking expressions on their faces were clear. They thought this would be a disaster. They thought he was nothing more than a joke. "Go on, Jamal," Ms. Harris urged, her voice laced with amusement. "Show us what you've got." Jamal hesitated for a moment, his heart thumping in his chest. But then he forced himself to walk toward the front of the room. He could feel the weight of their judgment, their expectation that he would fail. The room felt colder as he stood in front of them, his violin in his hands. The other teachers exchanged glances, exchanging knowing looks as they braced themselves for what they assumed would be a disaster. But Jamal wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about the music, the one thing that had always brought him comfort. He wasn't going to let their mockery stop him. With a deep breath, he placed the violin under his chin, his bow poised above the strings. For a brief moment, the room was silent. The teachers, still expecting him to falter, waited for the first off-key note. But Jamal's hands remained steady. He closed his eyes for a moment, blocking out the laughter in his mind, and then he began to play. The soft sound of the violin filled the room, its beautiful, mournful melody weaving through the air. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The teacher's laughter faded into the background, replaced by the sound of music, a sound that no one in the room expected to hear from him. But Jamal wasn't playing for them. He wasn't playing to prove a point. He was playing because, In that moment, the music was all he had. It was the one thing that made him feel like he belonged. It was the one thing that made him feel truly alive. As the notes echoed in the classroom, the teachers slowly fell silent. The smug expressions on their faces began to fade, replaced by confusion. Jamal's performance wasn't what they had expected. It was something far more beautiful than they could have imagined. But they didn't know yet. They didn't know that Jamal was about to prove them all wrong. Jamal's fingers danced delicately across the violin strings, producing a soft, almost haunting melody. The sound filled the room, slowly weaving its way through the cold, disapproving atmosphere. But as the notes grew louder and more confident, the tension in the room only increased. The teachers who had once mocked him now stood in stunned silence, unable to tear their eyes away from him. But the moment of calm didn't last long. Ms. Harris, the one who had started it all, was the first to recover from the shock. Her face, which had once been twisted with a mocking grin, now hardened with something else, something much more serious. She watched Jamal with a calculated gaze, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You think you're a musician, Jamal," she said, her voice sharp and cold, breaking the silence. "You really think you can impress us with this simple performance?" Her words were a direct challenge, one that Jamal could feel deep in his bones. The laughter and mockery that had filled the room earlier now seemed to return in the form of Miss Harris's harsh tone. The other teachers, who had fallen silent at first, began to murmur amongst themselves, exchanging looks as if to say, "Can he really play?" Jamal's heart began to race. He had played before, in the privacy of his room, or sometimes at the local community center. He had never played in front of such an audience, especially one that had so quickly judged him. For a moment, he considered stopping. Maybe if he walked away now, the teachers would think he had just been too nervous to play at all. But something deep inside him urged him to continue. They had underestimated him. They had assumed he was just another quiet boy in the back of the room, invisible to everyone. But Jamal was not just a boy who could be ignored. He was more than that, and he would prove it. Taking a deep breath, Jamal tightened his grip on the violin. Ms. Harris was watching him intently, her eyes full of expectation. She wanted him to falter. She wanted him to fail. It was as if she had set a trap, daring him to try and live up to the standards she had imposed. And Jamal was not going to disappoint her in the way she expected. "I'll show you what I can do," he muttered under his breath. The words weren't meant for anyone else. They were a promise he made to himself. Jamal began to play again, this time with more conviction. The melody swirled around him, flowing from his fingertips with a confidence he had never felt before. His bow moved across the strings with a fluidity that surprised even him. Each note was purposeful, each shift in tempo perfectly timed. The music he created was far from simple. It was complex, emotional, and most of all, it was beautiful. The other teachers were now watching him more intently than ever. Their earlier expressions of disbelief had melted into something else, something that could almost be called admiration. Even Ms. Harris, the woman who had challenged him, seemed to pause, her arms crossed tightly as she leaned against the desk, her gaze fixed on the boy in front of her. But Jamal knew he couldn't stop now. This wasn't just about playing well. It was about showing them the true depth of his talent. Every time he shifted the bow across the strings, he felt the music surge through him, like a wave pushing him forward. He was no longer just playing. He was telling a story of struggle, of resilience, and of the burning desire to be seen, to be recognized. The rhythm of the violin became faster, more intense. Jamal's hands moved with such precision that it was as if the violin was an extension of his body, each movement flowing effortlessly from one to the next. The sound that filled the room was no longer soft or hesitant. It was bold and powerful. It was the kind of music that could move mountains, that could make hearts race. Ms. Harris's eyes widened slightly, though she quickly masked it with a scowl. She had expected Jamal to falter, to lose control of the violin, to give in to the pressure. But he didn't. He kept playing, the music getting louder and more intricate with every passing second. The other teachers, who had once sneered at the idea of Jamal playing, were now completely captivated. They exchanged glances, trying to hide their astonishment, but it was clear that they had underestimated the boy. Jamal wasn't just playing an instrument, he was commanding the room with his music. For Jamal, this moment was about more than just proving his worth. It was about taking control of the narrative that had been written about him. For years, he had been seen as quiet, as invisible, as someone who didn't matter. But now, through his violin, he was proving that he was someone worth noticing. He refused to let the challenge of Ms. Harris and the judgment of his peers define him. This was his moment, his chance to show them who he truly was, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. The music soared to its peak, each note clearer and stronger than the last. Jamal was no longer playing for the teachers in the room. He was playing for himself. He had accepted the challenge, and now he was winning. The room, once filled with condescending chuckles and mocking stares, had now become eerily silent. The sound of Jamal's violin, which had started as a tentative and shy whisper, had grown into a powerful, commanding force that filled the entire space. Every note he played resonated with a depth that sent chills down the spines of those who were once skeptical. The teachers, those who had thought it would be nothing more than a humiliating spectacle, were now transfixed by the beauty of his performance. Ms. Harris, who had expected Jamal to falter, to struggle with the simplest notes, stood motionless by the desk. Her arms were crossed tightly across her chest, but her face betrayed a sense of disbelief. The stern expression that had once characterized her presence was now replaced by a mixture of surprise and awe. She had thought this boy, this quiet and unassuming figure, was nothing more than a joke. But the music he was playing was no joke. It was a profound expression of skill and emotion, one that no one could deny. As Jamal's bow moved in swift, practiced motions, his fingers expertly manipulating the strings of the violin, the teachers exchanged uneasy glances. They could no longer hide their astonishment. They had underestimated him, his talent, his grace, his ability to command such a powerful performance. What had started as an act of mockery had turned into something completely different, something they never expected. The music wasn't just beautiful, it was mesmerizing. The older man at the back of the room, who had been one of the most vocal in his skepticism, could hardly believe what he was hearing. He was a seasoned professional, one who had seen countless performances over the years, but Jamal's talent was undeniable. He watched with wide eyes, his mouth slightly agape. He had thought this was going to be a brief moment of embarrassment for the young boy, but instead, it was a breathtaking display of musical mastery. Jamal's hands moved so quickly, so fluidly, that it was as if the violin was an extension of his very soul. There was a shift in the air as the teacher's judgmental eyes began to soften. Ms. Harris, who had been the ringleader in ridiculing Jamal, now stood completely still, unable to look away from his performance. She had been the one to challenge him, to mock him in front of the class, but now she was the one who had to swallow her pride. What had started as a test for Jamal had turned into her own moment of reckoning. The room, which had been filled with laughter and disbelief just moments ago, was now completely still. The only sound was the beautiful melody pouring from the violin. Jamal's focus remained unwavering. He didn't notice the stunned faces of the teachers. He didn't notice the way their eyes had widened in shock. He was lost in the music, his body moving in harmony with each note, each bowstroke. His mind was consumed with the rhythm, with the melody, and with the feeling of proving, not to them, but to himself, that he was capable of far more than anyone could imagine. And then, as Jamal reached the crescendo of his performance, the music soared to its peak. The room seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the sound. It was powerful, emotional, and raw. The teachers, who had once seen Jamal as nothing more than a joke, were now witnessing a prodigy in action. Each note he played seemed to speak directly to their hearts, breaking down their preconceptions and forcing them to acknowledge the brilliance before them. Ms. Harris, who had made the decision to call Jamal up to the front of the room as a joke, now felt a pang of guilt. Her mind raced as she replayed her earlier words in her head. She had mocked him, belittled him, thinking he was just a boy who could never live up to their expectations. But she had been wrong. She had completely misjudged him. Jamal wasn't just a student. He was an artist, a musician with a gift that none of them had seen coming. The other teachers, too, stood frozen in awe. They had expected him to fail, to stammer through a few notes before retreating in embarrassment. Instead, they had been taken on an emotional journey, a journey that started with mockery and ended with admiration. Jamal's performance had shattered their expectations and shown them that talent could be hidden in the most unlikely of places. When the last note finally echoed through the room, there was complete silence. Jamal's hands trembled slightly, but he held the violin steady, his chest rising and falling with each breath. He slowly lowered his bow, his eyes opening for the first time since he began playing. The room, which had been filled with judgment, was now filled with a deep, almost reverential silence. And then it happened. One by one, the teachers began to applaud. At first, it was hesitant, unsure, as though they didn't know if they were allowed to express their admiration. But then, the applause grew stronger, more confident. It was no longer forced. It was genuine. Jamal had done it. He had won them over, not with words, but with the sheer power of his music. Jamal stood there, unsure of what to do. His heart was still pounding in his chest, his breath coming in quick bursts. The teachers continued to clap, but Jamal couldn't quite believe it. He had shown them what he was capable of. And for the first time, he felt seen. Not as the quiet boy in the back of the room, but as someone with a gift, someone worthy of respect. Ms. Harris, still standing by her desk, stared at him in stunned silence. Her face softened, and for the first time, Jamal saw her look at him not with disdain, but with something else, something that resembled admiration. The silence in the room was almost palpable, thick with emotion. Jamal stood at the front, holding his violin, his fingers still lightly resting on the strings. He couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The applause, which had started as a hesitant ripple, now echoed around the room, filling the space with admiration. He had done it. He had proved them wrong. But Jamal wasn't thinking about the applause. He wasn't thinking about the teachers who had once mocked him. His thoughts were far away, lost in the music, lost in the overwhelming sense of relief and accomplishment. He had done what he loved, what had always been his true passion, in front of people who thought he was nothing more than a joke, and he had shown them that he was capable of far more than they ever imagined. As the clapping slowly died down, Ms. Harris was the first to speak. Her voice, which had once been sharp and cold, now carried a different tone, a tone of respect. "Jamal," she began, her words measured and sincere, "I have to admit, I never expected that. You've shown me something today that I will not forget." Jamal stood silently, his heart racing as he looked at her. He didn't know what to say. The way Ms. Harris, who had once humiliated him, was speaking now seemed almost surreal, but he had earned her respect. He had earned the respect of every teacher in that room. The other teachers, who had been watching him with awe, began to offer their praise as well. "Incredible," one of them murmured. "That was beyond anything we could have imagined." Another teacher, who had been quietly observing from the back, nodded in agreement. "You've got real talent, Jamal. We had no idea." The weight of their words hung in the air. Jamal's eyes welled up, but he quickly blinked the tears away, not wanting to show any weakness. He had fought hard to get here, to this moment where he was finally seen for who he truly was, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. I've been playing for years, but I never had the chance to show anyone. I never thought anyone would care." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of self-doubt, of hiding his passion behind the walls of his own fear. Ms. Harris walked over to him, her expression softer now. "I'm sorry, Jamal," she said, her voice low. "I shouldn't have judged you. I made a mistake. You are incredibly talented, and I should have seen that." There was a sincerity in her words that Jamal had never expected. She wasn't just apologizing for the mockery. She was acknowledging his worth, his potential. Jamal's heart swelled with emotion. He had never expected to hear those words from her, especially not after all the mockery he had faced. But here she was, admitting her mistake, recognizing him for what he truly was, not just a quiet, overlooked boy, but a gifted musician with a future ahead of him. The other teachers gathered around him now, each offering words of encouragement, each telling him how impressed they were by his performance. One teacher placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've got a future ahead of you, Jamal," he said. "Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." For the first time in his life, Jamal felt truly seen. He felt as though the years of being overlooked, of being dismissed as just another quiet kid, had come to an end. This moment, this performance, had marked a turning point in his life. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer the boy no one expected anything from. He was someone with a gift, someone worthy of recognition. As Jamal turned to leave the room, the teachers continued to watch him, their expressions now filled with admiration and respect. Jamal walked out of the classroom with his head held high, the weight of his violin case no longer feeling like a burden. Instead, it felt like a symbol of all he had overcome. The door closed behind him, and for a moment, her room was silent again. But this time, the silence wasn't filled with mockery or judgment. It was filled with something else, something much more powerful. It was filled with the recognition of a young boy who had shown the world what he was capable of. And it was filled with hope for the future, a future where Jamal could truly shine. Jamal had walked into that room as a joke, the target of mockery and ridicule. But he had left it as something much more. He had left it as a winner. Not because he had proved the teachers wrong, but because he had finally proven to himself that his talent was real and that he was worthy of recognition. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Jamal felt ready to face it. His music, his passion, would carry him forward, and nothing, no one, could take that away from him.